Aqui estamos para mais uma edição de Pertinente. Muito boa noite, seja bem-vindo a este programa da Fundação Francisco Manuel dos Santos, dedicado a entrevistas com grandes personalidades internacionais ligadas à sociedade, política e economia. Hoje vamos estar à conversa com um dos maiores especialistas em geopolítica e política internacional, François Heisbourg, antigo presidente do International Institute for Strategic Studies e conselheiro de Emmanuel Macron durante a sua campanha presidencial em matérias ligadas à segurança nacional e terrorismo também. Heisbourg é um autor que escreveu vários livros sobre esses temas e a gestão entre as grandes superpotências globais. François, it's a pleasure to speak with you. Here I am in Lisbon, there you are in Reykjavik. Thank you for taking the time. You have, it is a pleasure for us as well. You have an incredible amount of experience working at a senior level with governments, international institutions, dealing with the dynamics of the world's superpowers and their influence. So help set the stage for us right now. In your latest book, you talked about the predators of our time, Russia, China, and the United States. So let's kick it off by hearing who you think are the greatest predators of our time.
Each one of these three predators is a predator in a different way. So you can't really compare them in terms of, how to put it, size. China is obviously the rising predator, the one which has a historical revenge to take on nearly 2 centuries of history, which wants to reclaim its what it sees as its unrivaled position before the 19th century. Then we have Russia, which has a very clearly revisionist agenda, which wants to turn back the outcome of the end of the Cold War some 30 years ago. And then we have the United States, which is trying to make sure that its primacy remains, if not uncontested, at least that it remains number one in a number of areas. And this notion of predation is a different notion than the one of whether this or that country is friendly or unfriendly or has an ideology. Predation is more about, how to put it, appetite. It's a relatively neutral concept, which is why you can have very different countries such as China, Russia, and the United States with this predatory label, if I could put it that way.
Okay, well, let's sink our teeth into China, who obviously has been rising in prominence over the last years. Talk to us about the need to deal with them and how much a compromise as well is required from the traditional Western powers in order to utilize them and play ball with them, and at the same time also try to balance the accepting of human rights and some abuses that can be happening internally and also in the production of goods.
Yeah, over the last 20, 25 years, things have changed entirely. And 20, 25 years ago, the West had a rather naive vision of China as a country whose growth should be encouraged, and which in growing would become more like the West, not necessarily a democracy, but would become, to use that American expression of the time, a responsible stakeholder. This is not at all what is happening. China is, of course, now a rival superpower to the United States, but the emphasis is on rivalry. It is on systemic challenge, to use the expression coined by the European Union in 2019, and which NATO has also just adopted during the recent trip by President Biden to Europe. China sees herself as the bearer of an anti-democratic message. It has its own narrative. It views the West as being decadent and inefficient, And the West, of course, and notably the US, but increasingly also the Europeans, see themselves as being on the defensive, trying to defend their democratic institutions, their democratic way of life. So it doesn't look as if there is going to be much space for compromise. Maybe an armistice, if I can put it that way. But no, there is a really head-on confrontation, which is in the making. And it's happening because this is what is wanted both in Beijing and in Washington. This is the only thing on which the United States and China agree. That is that there is a basic confrontation of values, but also a confrontation of interests, because of course the strategic situation in the Indo-Pacific region had been dominated by the United States since the Second World War. And this is also what China is challenging, independently of any consideration of values. So it's a fairly bleak picture. That doesn't mean that one cannot work together. During the Cold War, the United States, the West, could work with the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact, on certain issues like arms control, like nuclear non-proliferation. But overall, it was an opposition of systems, and today we have an opposition of systems.
Let's talk about China's rival. I mean, it's fair to say there's a jockeying of position for number one. We all know how much the United States loves being number one and how much Americans like to say they are number one. With the election of Joe Biden, after a tumultuous period in every sense with Donald Trump, how do you see the current international positioning of the U.S. with Biden, and what has changed in also that dynamic with China and also with Europe?
What has changed and what hasn't changed? What has obviously changed is that Biden wants to work with America's partners and allies in Asia and in Europe, is ready to play a multilateral game, obviously, if at all possible, along lines and terms congenial to Washington, but still it is a multilateral game, and this was obviously the exact opposite to what was done by President Trump, who was constantly treating allies and partners rather in the same manner that he would treat America's enemies and antagonists. Indeed, in some ways, he tended to treat the antagonists better than his allies, as we saw with his bromance with Putin and his love fest with Kim Jong-un. What hasn't changed, and this is something which the Europeans have to understand, is, of course, America's reaction to the rise of China. That reaction began under Obama. It was strengthened under Trump, and it is certainly continuing today under Biden. This is the one, not only foreign policy area in which there is a consensus between the Republicans and the Democrats in the United States. It's actually, to my understanding, the only area across the board in which there is a bipartisan consensus. That also gives enormous impetus to the China policy of whoever is president of the United States. President Biden in early June got 68 votes in the Senate out of 100 in favor of the Endless Frontier Bill, which is designed to confront China's scientific and research push towards primacy. That's an enormous figure, and as I say, it's the only area in which this sort of consensus exists. So there is the continuity factor is at least as important as the change factor.
I like the fact that you mentioned that Donald Trump had a bromance with Putin, and he did, and the relationship also with North Korea. I think everybody around the world was a little bit confused about what was going on, because the treatment of traditional allies like the UK and Europe was very hot and cold. There were a lot of mixed messages. From that perspective, now with Biden, can the US be a credible partner for Europe? And how can they work better together for their common interests?
On the merits, the answer is clearly yes. Biden is known practically by every senior statesman in the world, and even in the academic world. I would put it that way. Biden is somebody one has inevitably encountered sometime during the last 40 years. I mean, so there is an element of knowledge and trust on both sides, which is very strong. In context, it's a different story, of course, because everybody remembers that the United States did elect Donald Trump in 2016, that it was actually quite a close-run thing this time around. And God only knows what will happen at the midterm elections this year, or more pretentiously in the 1994 and the 2024 presidential elections in the United States. So there is this apprehension which will hold back the Europeans from a bigger embrace of the changes in Washington than would otherwise have been the case. So that element of trust, which is not linked to the person of Biden, is indeed much weaker than it was before before Donald Trump became president.
François, let's turn our attention to another topic that you're well versed in, which is terrorism and national security. I'm really curious because over the last 2 years, we all know that COVID took over our lives in every sense, our professional lives, our personal lives, our media lives. I mean, COVID completely dominated the headlines. And it seemed that a topic that was on the agenda constantly was terrorism, but it kind of dropped off. Tell us what you've observed over the last 2 years during the pandemic. What has happened to a lot of the terrorist organizations and networks, and have they taken advantage of maybe national security agencies taking their eye off the ball?
There's several questions there. Have they taken advantage? We don't know, or we don't know yet. My suspicion is that on the balance, probably not, because the movement of people has become even more difficult under COVID than before. And of course, international terrorism requires the movement of terrorists. Funds have to move around, operatives have to move around, weapons have to move around. And this has not been made easier by COVID for them as for anybody else. So I am moderately confident on that side. The other thing, of course, is that terrorism in Europe and to some extent in the US was set back quite clearly when the Islamic State, Daesh, was essentially defeated on the ground in the Middle East, in Iraq and Syria, in 2017, 2018, just before the pandemic, and that is one of the reasons why terrorist incidents in the developed countries have been fairly muted compared to what they were 5, 6, 7 years ago. The bad news is that COVID or no COVID, Daesh and Al-Qaeda franchises in other areas, and notably in Africa, in Nigeria, in the Sahel, have been developing very, very strongly. And we see this with the problem the French and some of the European partners have today in the in the Sahel. In Nigeria, Boko Haram has to some extent been a little bit weakened during a couple of years because of the power struggle between the Islamic State wing and the Al-Qaeda wing factions within Boko Haram. But that appears to have been settled with the elimination of the former head of Boko Haram by his own partners in crime. So unfortunately, there is no good news. Things are getting worse in Western Africa. And of course, the economic hardship created by the pandemic is not helping. It makes available more young recruits for big paying criminal and terrorist franchises.
Of course, a lot of these terrorist franchises and groups try to also recruit influential members in Europe. I wanted to talk about your native country because in France, obviously, it has been a topic of discussion and tensions have risen as a result of this topic of how to deal with Islamic extremism and the role that it can play behind the scenes in French society. How have you seen the situation in France from a national security and political standpoint with Emmanuel Macron and the progress or not that has been made containing or controlling the rise of extremism in France?
The rise of extremism is very real, and it's two-sided, which makes it worse. That is, it's not simply the rise of political Islam, radical Islam in the country. It's also the rise of the extreme right, neo-fascist right, sometimes in reaction to Islamic radicalism, sometimes a rather more opportunistic interaction between the two. And this is not getting any better. COVID has not had, to my understanding, had a direct effect on the situation because unemployment, slowdown of economic activity has been fairly well managed in France as in other European countries by the government. But the situation is extremely disturbing, and there are two aspects which I'd like to underline. The first, of course, is that we have presidential and legislative elections in a bit less than a year's time, and law and order are clearly going to be one of the major wedge issues during that election. This is already visible. Is already visible today. The other thing is, and this is something which we don't have very much data on for the moment, and that is, COVID has been around for practically a year and a half now. People have remained locked up to some extent. They've not led normal lives. A lot of aggressivity appears at the anecdotal level. Both in terms of how people handle themselves in their daily lives, but also the tone of political debate has become much nastier. So there is the possibility that the stress of the COVID period leads to a hardening of political and social life in the country, and that's obviously not good news.
I actually wanted to pick up on that quickly and just get your opinion on if you feel that, and taking the example of France, but I think globally, if during COVID, because of the influence of digital and social media, you felt that actually society has become more polarized in the way that they address the issues, and you mentioned the word aggression. If you feel it has become more violent in tone during COVID?
It has become more violent in tone, and of course the fact that people have been very much more online than was the case before, both through distance working, but also simply because it was one of the few things that people had left to do when they were not able to leave their homes or their town easily. And of course, if you're online, chances are you're going to be on social media. And if you're on the social media, we all know how the algorithms of a number of the major players work, and the algorithms tend to favor a polarization of pre-existing attitudes. That's the specific responsibility of the big operators like YouTube or Facebook or whatever. I know they're aware of the issue, but that doesn't mean that it is necessarily being handled the way it should.
You mentioned elections in France. Obviously, those will be crucial for the political chessboard of Europe. Also, we'll have elections in Germany. What effects do you think this can have on peripheral countries like Portugal within the European Union in the direction that these big players go in?
Yeah, the German factor here is really important because it looks as if Germany were going to enter a new moment in its post-war political cycle with the Greens becoming a major player in a future coalition whose basic outlines are for the moment obviously completely undetermined. We'll have to wait for the election for that. But the chances is that we're not going to have the same type of interaction in the political sphere as we've had, let's say, since Angela Merkel came to power in 2005. That's already more than 15 years. On balance, I think this is a good thing because the French-German relationship, although it has kept working, has become increasingly stale over the years, much less operative than it was, let's say, under Angela Merkel's predecessors or under the predecessors of the current, of the last 3 or 4 French presidents. There will be a more open discussion, I think a more constructive discussion between France and Germany, not always very easy, but I'm actually quite optimistic, provided, of course, that we don't have a political catastrophe in France. I don't foresee one, by the way. I think, although I'm not a betting man, if somebody told me that I had to go and bet, I would obviously bet on the extreme right not coming to power in France in 2022. So a revigorated French-German relationship, and this, I think, will be good for Europe in general, notably because I suspect the future German coalition will be more flexible and more open-minded, notably on what I would call the federalization of debt in the European Union. And you already have the recovery plan, which some people call the Hamiltonian moment. I'm not sure it was a Hamiltonian moment, but it was a big shift, notably by Germany. This may become the new normal with the political changes in Germany. And that would be, I think, very much to the advantage of the peripheral countries of the continent, which will benefit naturally from a higher degree of federalization of debts and assets.
Okay. Let's hope you're right on that. We started the conversation talking about some of the superpowers, the predators. I wanted to start wrapping up this chat also by bringing up Russia and China, because for the West they could be seen as a little bit of the two-headed monster, the championship of bad guys. Who should the West be more worried about from a political and economic standpoint?
Well, I have my own formula on this one. It's slightly flippant, but I think it's also basically true. That is, for Europe, Russia is like the weather today, whereas China is like climate change. Okay. You obviously have to deal with the weather today, and if you're in Eastern Europe, that means that you're obviously more concerned about Russia than anybody else. But the big thing is the rise of China. In that sense, it is like climate change in more ways than one, I would add, since it's also the number one country in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So these two countries are not operating on the same timelines. They don't have the same elements of power either. I mean, China is a superpower already. Or superpower en devenir, as the French would put it. Russia is a former superpower and is trying to enhance, to recover some of its lost positions. China and Russia are not allies in the sense that they have a mutual defense pact. If Russia gets in trouble with the West in Ukraine, for example, China is not going to come to its rescue. If China has problems with the Philippines or Malaysia in the South China Sea, Russia is not going to come to the rescue of China. So it's not that sort of alliance. Conversely, both countries have a very strong incentive not, of course, to have problems between themselves, which would distract them from their biggest outside problem, which is the United States of America. So Russia and China essentially have decided that they were not going to have border frictions, that they were going to handle relations with the Central Asian republics in a reasonably convivial manner, a bit in a competition, but it's a managed competition. On the one hand, and on the other hand, Russia and China share a common rejection of democracy. They have a shared embrace of autocracy, and therefore, well, in the United Nations, the two countries will tend to vote together, to veto together whenever human rights come up. And each country has decided not to disturb the efforts of the other when it comes to his pet projects. You know, China does not support Russia on, let's say, the annexation of Crimea, not directly, but China does not get into Russia's way. And Russia does not support directly China, let's say, against Vietnam in the South China Sea. Vietnam is very much a friend of Russia's. But Russia is going to get into the way of China in the South China Sea. So it's a sort of mutual non-aggression. It's a free hands pact, if I can put it that way. Each country gets the benefit of peace and quiet along their very long common border, and they get the benefit of being, as it were, engaged together against the West, but not having to bear the burden of the defense of the Chinese or the Russian partner.
François, time is nearly running out, but I'd like to close with what we call a quick fire round, which is some quick answers to questions that I have. So in a sentence or two, if possible, and I know some of these answers would take longer in normal circumstances, but in one sentence or two, describe how you see the world order of superpowers and what could change in the next decade.
The competition is going to harden between the superpowers, and it will focus very much on the competition between democracy and autocracy. And this is not simply because that's the way Joe Biden wants it to be. It's that way because that is how China sees it as well. There is a common agreement between Washington and China that there is a contest between the democracies and the autocracies. And this is the polarization which will structure the international system over the next 20, 30 years.
Okay, so that actually flows well into the second question, which is talking specifically about leaders and leadership models. What is one personality trait that, in your opinion, a leader should have?
One word: carefulness. This is a very, very, very fractured, violent world. It hasn't become better with COVID. It's going to get a lot worse with climate change, which is going to increase competition, like COVID increased competition. COVID was a very interesting test run in that respect. One would have thought, oh, there's a pandemic, we'll all work together against it. We did not work together against it. We worked against each other. This is what will happen. In that kind of universe, you want a leader who is very careful, very deliberate, whatever his objectives may be.
What is the biggest challenge humanity faces in the next decade?
Climate change.
Yeah.
Very simple. Pure and simple. Decades rather than decade. This is going to become bigger and bigger as the century goes on.
And in just a few words, if you could change anything in the world today by magic, what would you do?
I would stop investment in carbon energy extraction now. That all new investment should be stopped.
Yeah.
That to me would be the one really big thing on which hopefully humanity could agree.
François, thank you so much once again for your time. It's been truly fascinating discussing these very important, very pertinent topics to all of us, not just who are living in countries connected with the superpowers, but even countries like Portugal, where all of this also has an effect, in the domino effect of decisions that are made at the highest level. All the best, good luck with everything, and stay safe.
Thank you very much, Pedro.
Thank you very much. As palavras de François Heisbourg, e foram aqui temas, na verdade, muito interessantes e pertinentes para a atualidade. Falámos na corrida entre os superpoderes para atingir a superioridade total, e especialmente no duelo entre a China e os Estados Unidos. Falámos na ameaça que a China posa para a democracia global. Abordámos também o terrorismo e o que é que aconteceu durante a pandemia às várias organizações terroristas internacionais, tanto no Médio Oriente, em África, mas também na Europa. E terminamos com um tema que é recorrente nestes programas, que é a importância da sustentabilidade e da forma de trabalharmos juntos para conseguir garantir a proteção do meio ambiente e do planeta. Foi mais uma edição de Pertinente, da Fundação Francisco Manuel dos Santos, porque, como sabemos, quando há factos, há argumentos.